Well, welcome to the small group portion of Enemies of the Heart. Again, I'm so excited for the fact that you've chosen to give this another week to gather with some of your friends and to have a conversation about the things that attack our heart. And last week what we looked at is we just looked at out this whole idea that our heart needs to be guarded, that our heart needs to be protected because our heart has enemies. We have things that are coming against our heart to try to destroy us. And if we're going to live the kind of life that God wants us to live, and we're going to live a victorious life, then we have to understand that there's some things that we have to do. And there's some things that we can't do. And one of the things that we have to do is to guard our hearts. Our hearts produce all kinds of emotions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at this first emotion that can be an enemy of our heart, that can attack us if we don't have the right understanding of it. And this first enemy that we're going to look at is called guilt. Now, when you hear the word guilt, you probably don't need me to define what guilt is. You know what guilt is. You know when you feel guilt. You know when you don't feel guilt. The whole idea of dealing with guilt can be a pretty big deal. Especially when you've done some things that you're not proud of, and you've got some things in your past or maybe some things in your present that just cause you to have an incredibly guilty heart. And guilt is something that God does not want us to have. There's a big difference between conviction and guilt, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But guilt is not something that God wants us to have. He doesn't want us to be going around with this idea that I am guilty all of the time. This is what guilt has to say. As we're going to talk about these four emotions, we're going to talk about the debt-debtor relationship and how when you have a debt, there's only two ways really to get rid of a debt. You have to pay it off, or you have to have somebody cancel the debt. And fortunately, what God does for us in these enemies of the heart is He cancels these debts. But we've got to figure out how to do that and how to let Him do that. So this is what guilt says. Guilt says, I owe you. When I feel guilty, and I feel guilt towards anything, what I'm saying is that I owe you. In other words, I've messed up. I can't feel guilty about something if I don't think that I've made a mistake. I don't think that I've messed up. So guilt says that I owe you. The answer to this is confession. So if I've wronged you, if I've done something, if my behavior has been in such a way that has caused pain, then I feel guilty because I've done that, and the way that I can overcome that guilt is to confess it, is to let you know that I am coming clean with what it is that I've done, what it is that I've said, or what it is that I haven't done. Confession is tough. Confession is not one of those things that just really comes natural for us. And the primary reason I think confession is so hard is because confession almost never happens on a volunteer basis. Usually when you confess something, it's because you've been caught. Usually when I confess something, it's because I've painted myself in the corner, I've gotten myself blocked in, and I'm now forced to do this. Rarely do you think the first thing that I need to do when you start getting off track a little bit is, you know what, I need to confess. That's not what we do. But that's what we need to do because confession is so important. So it's rarely volunteer, and that makes it hard. Another thing that makes confession a little bit hard is that we confuse confession with I'm sorry. I think a lot of times people say, well, all I really need to do is say that I'm sorry. I've said something I shouldn't say, I've done something I shouldn't do, and so what I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to say I'm sorry. In fact, we teach our children that. We teach our children those kind of phrases. You know, you're supposed to say please, you're supposed to say thank you, and you're supposed to say I'm sorry. Well, saying I'm sorry is not enough. That's not really what confession is at all. Saying I'm sorry is that. You're sorry for whatever the situation is. Confession, when I confess something, what I'm doing then is I'm trying to say, you know what, I know that what I've done is wrong. I know what I've said is wrong, and now I want to try to make it right. So it's taking the I am sorry one step further. So you should never just tell somebody you're sorry. You should say I'm sorry, and that should be followed up with, and what can I do to make it right? We looked at 5 confessions of steps. I just want to review those a little bit about what these 5 confessions steps are. The first one is this, is I have to admit to sin. I have to admit that what I've done is wrong. Now, this is an important step. something that's becoming harder and harder for people to do, especially in our culture. We live in a culture where there is no wrong. We live in a culture where there is no black and white, that everybody just does whatever they want to do, and then they can justify just about any behavior. So this idea that of coming to an admission of what I have done is wrong is an important one. So I have to admit the sin. After I admit the sin, I have to confess it to God. That's important. I need to go to God and I need to confess it. But after that, and this is the hard part, because a lot of times this is what we'll do, especially for those that are we're in church, we've been around church, we're part of a small group, we're doing those kinds of things. We understand when we do something wrong, we'll admit it, we'll confess it to God. But the third step in confession is this: I must confess to the offended person. And that's when it really starts getting tough. Now I've got to go to the person that I've offended. I've got to go to the person that I've sinned against. I got to go to the person that I've hurt. And I've got to confess to them that what I have done is wrong. And then once I do that, I have to follow that up as I got to make it right as best as I can. Now, we can't always make something right. You can't, there's the old saying, you can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube, and sometimes there's just not anything that we can do, but most of the time there's something that we can do. And when we confess to the person that we've hurt, then we've got to follow up that step and say, what can I do to make this right? And a lot of times, if we're honest, we know what to do to make it right. We just don't necessarily want to do it, but that is an important next step. And then the last step is to move on. And this is an important step. This move on step is very important. If I admit my sin, I confess it to God, I confess it to the person that I've hurt, I've done everything that I can within my power to make that right, then I have to move on. One of the things that makes guilt so bad and such an enemy of the heart is that we allow it to continue to beat us up. One of the things that football coaches tell their teams all the time is don't let a bad loss beat you twice. You lose once, that's fine. You do what? You follow the steps, you move forward. Moving on is a very important step. So take some time as you've gathered in your group to look at some of the things, to go through the steps of confession, to go through the discussion groups that we have about the stuff that we've been reading and about some of the sermons that we've been hearing on this, and talk about it, talk it out. Don't be afraid to say and ask your questions, and because this discussion part of this is so very important. Can't wait to hear all of the good things that's gonna come out of your discussion. So happy discussion, and we will see you next week.